Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging into, well, the really high-stakes world of foreign policy decision-making.
Yeah, it's a world where choices are made under pressure, often with huge uncertainty and risk.
Exactly. And our mission today, we're going to unpack how India, a rising global power, navigated a really rapidly changing international landscape, especially in those decades after the Cold War ended.
And we have quite an amazing source for this deep dive. It's the book Choices: Inside the Making of India's Foreign Policy by Shiv Shankar Menon.
Ah, Menon.
Right. And what makes this so valuable is, well, he wasn't just watching from the sidelines. He was deeply involved in many of these key moments.
So an insider's perspective.
Absolutely, on five foundational decisions that, profoundly shaped modern India's place in the world.
So for you listening, this isn't just going to be a dry history lesson. We promise we're going to try and peel back the layers, understand the dilemmas, the risks they took, the calculations.
And the long-term consequences, yeah. How these choices really set India on its current path.
Get ready for some aha moments, hopefully, about how nations actually navigate their destiny. Okay, let's dive in. Our first deep dive takes us straight to a real historical flashpoint, India's relationship with China. Specifically, that long-standing, pretty fraught, unresolved border dispute.
And this isn't just lines on a map, is it?
Not at all. It's steeped in history, claims over places like the McMahon Line, Aksa Chin, and of course, looming over everything, the really traumatic 1962 war.
Yeah, that war left deep psychological scars, decades worth.
And things really heated up again in the mid-'80s, didn't they?
They did, dramatically. Indian and Chinese patrols were clashing more and more often. The big one was the Sumdurong 2 standoff, or Wang Dong, as China calls it, back in '86.
And that wasn't just a minor incident.
Oh no, it dragged on. It actually took 7 years of negotiation just to get things back to the way they were on the ground before the standoff. 7 years.
Wow. Incredible tension. So what was going on globally and, inside India and China around the early 90s that maybe made an agreement possible despite all that history?
Yeah, that's a great question because the context is crucial. Globally, everything was shifting. The Soviet Union, gone, collapsed.
Leaving the U.S. as the sole superpower.
Right. And China, they were still dealing with the aftermath of Tiananmen Square. They desperately needed stability outside their borders to focus on reform and economic growth at home.
The whole hide our capacities and bide our time strategy.
Exactly, Deng Xiaoping's famous phrase. At the very same time, India was facing its own major crisis, the economic crisis of 1990-91.
So India needed breathing room, too.
Absolutely. To push through its economic liberalization, India needed peace, especially a quiet border with China.
Okay, so here's the crucial choice point. You have this public sentiment in India, still feeling the sting of '62, wanting lost territory back.
Strong feelings.
But India chose pragmatism instead. They signed the 1993 Border Peace and Tranquility Agreement, basically committing to maintain the status quo on the line of actual control, the LAC.
That's right.
Given the emotions, how did they pull that off politically?
Well, this is where Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao's quiet diplomacy comes in. He was very effective, but low-key.
How so?
He didn't just announce it. He spent time building consensus, quietly briefing key opposition leaders, including Atal Bihari Vajpayee, who was a major figure.
So reaching across the aisle.
Yes. And apparently, Vajpayee himself suggested adding the principle of equal and mutual security into the agreement. That was key to getting broader political buy-in. It showed real foresight, putting long-term stability ahead of, short-term political points.
And the result, it's actually quite surprising, isn't it?
It really is. Because even though the LAC itself was never formally agreed upon, never demarcated, still isn't, that border became India's most peaceful for something like 30 years. The last death in a clash there was way back in 1975.
And that peace allowed trade to just explode between the two countries?
Huge expansion, yes. But that peace is definitely being tested now. China's become much more assertive since around 2008.
We've seen incidents like Depsang in 2013, Galwan more recently.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Although it's worth noting that in those earlier incidents like Depsang, India's own improved capabilities, plus the mechanism set up by that '93 agreement, actually helped resolve things, well, relatively quicker.
But the core problem remains.
And the core problem remains. That crucial next step, actually clarifying where the LAC is, that process basically stalled around 2002 and hasn't restarted.
So, looking back at this choice, what's the enduring lesson here about dealing with these really complex, deep-seated border issues?
I think the lesson is about pragmatism. Maybe you can't solve the problem entirely, but you can manage it. It suggests that a mix of Calm rhetoric, showing you have strength, but also giving your adversary a way out, a dignified off-ramp. That can work. Prioritizing stability can sometimes be more valuable than pushing maximalist claims.
Okay, let's shift gears. Another really pivotal relationship transformation, India and the U.S.
Right. A relationship that was, as the source puts it, bedeviled for over 30 years.
And the main reason, nuclear sanctions. Following India's 1974 nuclear tests, how did they even begin to move past such a huge obstacle?
Well, the change really started on the U.S. side, a strategic recalculation. Washington began to see a rising India as a necessary partner,
Especially after 9/11.
especially after 9/11, yes. That event really aligned views on terrorism and counterterrorism. This convergence led to something called the Next Steps in Strategic Partnership, the NSSP, in 2004.
Is setting the stage.
Exactly, setting the stage for something much bigger, much more ambitious.
Which brings us to the next big choice. The announcement in 2005 of the India-U.S. Civil Nuclear Initiative.
A huge deal.
The goal being to resume civilian nuclear cooperation, even though India hadn't signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT.
Which was the core of the problem for decades.
Right. It felt like they were tackling the most difficult issue head-on. How complicated was it to actually make this happen, not just bilaterally, but on the world stage?
Oh, incredibly complicated. It was a real diplomatic marathon, as you said earlier. Just think about the steps involved.
Okay, break it down for us.
Well, first, the U.S. had to actually change its own laws that involved passing the Hyde Act. Then, they needed a detailed bilateral nuclear cooperation pact, the 123 agreement.
Okay.
Then, India had to negotiate a specific safeguards agreement with the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA. And maybe the toughest part, getting a consensus exception from the Nuclear Suppliers Group, the NSG. That's the cartel of countries controlling nuclear trade.
Consensus meaning every single member had to agree.
Every single member. And India had key demands too, like guarantees on fuel supply, the right to decide which of its own reactors were civilian, including its sensitive breeder reactor.
And critically,
ensuring the whole deal didn't somehow limit its independent nuclear weapons program. That was a red line.
sounds like a minefield. Were there big hurdles inside India too? And how did they deal with the inevitable international objections?
Oh, absolutely. Domestically, it was intense, huge political drama. The left parties who were supporting the government then were fiercely opposed. Even some within the ruling Congress Party had serious reservations.
Why? What were their concerns?
They saw it as maybe selling out to the U.S. or compromising India's self-reliance in nuclear technology. It became this huge year-long political battle inside India.
And internationally?
Internationally, they had to overcome resistance from the so-called mini-six countries like Ireland, Austria, New Zealand, who were very strong non-proliferation advocates. That took intense diplomatic effort.
And China?
China played its cards very strategically. They sort of waited, didn't commit, delayed their support until the absolute last minute. September 6, 2008, literally as the global financial crisis was starting to explode.
Wow, high drama.
But in the end,
It worked. India got what's called a clean exemption. It respected all of India's red lines. No mention of future nuclear testing, no discriminatory clauses, no periodic review. Full civil nuclear cooperation was back on the table. So what was the bigger significance of this deal? Why is it seen as such a landmark?
it was truly a game changer because it removed that decades-old nuclear obstacle. The source calls it the detritus of the past. That opened the door for much broader cooperation in defense, high-tech trade, maritime security, global issues. You name it.
And leadership was key.
Absolutely crucial. The quiet persistence, the strategic vision of Prime Minister Manmohan Singh in India and President George W. Bush in the U.S., that partnership really drove it through.
So what's the strategic lesson we can take away from navigating such a complex international agreement like this one?
I think it shows that, when your national interest is clear and you pursue it with determined leadership and really skilled professional negotiation, you actually can overcome deeply entrenched obstacles and political opposition. You can transform relationships.
Let's shift now to a really shocking and tragic event, the 26/11 Mumbai terrorist attacks in 2008. A horrific event, described in the source as possibly the most well-documented terror attack anywhere. And the links seemed clear, didn't they? To Pakistan's Lashkar-e-Taiba, the Lati, and its intelligence agency, the ISI.
Very clear, yes. The evidence was overwhelming, even in real time.
So in the immediate aftermath, there must have been immense pressure inside India to hit back militarily.
Huge pressure. Public outrage, political pressure. The author, Menon, who was foreign secretary at the time, admits he himself initially argued for immediate visible retaliation.
Understandable.
Completely. The raw emotion, the shock, watching it unfold live on TV screens around the world,
Yeah.
it was intense.
And yet, India made a different choice. The critical policy choice was one of restraint.
Yes. After, exhaustive discussions at the very highest levels, the decision makers concluded that India actually stood to gain more by not attacking Pakistan militarily.
That must have been an incredibly tough call to make, especially facing that public anger. What were the specific reasons against military action that won out?
It was a very pragmatic, multi-layered rationale. First, they figured a military strike would immediately muddy the waters. It would obscure Pakistan's clear guilt in the eyes of the world.
So
It would just become another India-Pakistan dispute, which, ironically, would probably help the Pakistan army shift the narrative away from their complicity.
interesting. What else?
Second, an attack would likely have united the Pakistani public behind their army and weakened the civilian government there, which India actually hoped, perhaps optimistically, to work with.
Okay.
Third, there was the question of military utility. What targets would they hit? Striking, tin sheds and huts used by terrorists has limited lasting impact. They can be rebuilt easily, and the risk of civilian casualties was very high.
And the economy?
That was the final point. A war, even a limited one, would have carried significant economic costs for India. And this was happening right in the middle of the 2008 global financial meltdown. The timing couldn't have been worse.
So, by choosing restraint, what were the perceived benefits?
The main benefit was clarity. India remained the clear victim. It was then free to pursue all legal and covert means to bring the perpetrators to justice without the complication of an active conflict.
And did this strategy work in terms of isolating Pakistan?
It did, quite effectively. It led to UN Security Council sanctions on Leti figures. And remarkably, it resulted in unprecedented counterterrorism cooperation from countries you might not expect, like Saudi Arabia. Even China shared some intelligence eventually.
Despite Pakistan's reaction.
Well, Pakistan continued its prevarications, as the source politely puts it, despite overwhelming evidence, including their own investigators acknowledging the attack originated there. Key figures like Zaki or Rahman Lakvi were essentially allowed to operate from prison.
So the real success wasn't necessarily getting convictions in Pakistan?
No, the source argues the real success was isolating Pakistan internationally and making global counterterrorism efforts against these groups much more effective in the long run.
This whole episode raises that bigger question about the utility of force against non-state actors, doesn't it? People sometimes talk about Israel's mowing the grass strategy.
Right. Short, limited military actions, often from the air, aimed more at degrading capability, attrition, rather than achieving total deterrence.
Why is India's situation seen as different? Why wasn't that approach considered the right one here?
Because India faces a fundamentally different challenge. It's dealing with state-sponsored, non-state actors backed by a nuclear-armed state, Pakistan. In that complex environment, conventional deterrence doesn't really work against groups like Lesti. Their motivations are deeper.
So what's the alternative?
India's approach, as described here, relies more on asymmetric measures and unrelenting pressure. Political, diplomatic, economic, intelligence-led, internal security measures, rather than just overt military force.
Because military force could backfire.
It could play right into the terrorists' hands. Often their goal is to provoke a disproportionate response for political effect. So overt military force is only one tool and not always the best one.
So what does this teach us about national security when facing terrorism?
I think it shows that sometimes, especially when provocation is the goal, strategic restraint can actually be a more powerful weapon than immediate force.
Sure.
It allows you to build international consensus, isolate the adversary, and apply pressure in other ways that military action might actually undermine. But, and this is really important, there's a provocative conclusion in the source.
Go on.
While restraint was judged the right call in 2008, the author, Menon, suggests that given Pakistan's continued behavior, should another such attack be mounted, it would be virtually impossible for any government of India to make the same choice again.
Wow. So a potential shift in future calculus.
A very strong signal of a shift, yes, implying that the conditions that allowed for restraint then might not exist next time.
Okay, let's journey now to Sri Lanka, next door in 2009. This was the brutal end phase of their 26-year civil war. The climax that saw the elimination of the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, the LTTE.
A truly vicious conflict, rooted, of course, in the long-standing grievances of Sri Lanka's Tamil minority.
And The LTTE became infamous, didn't they? They pioneered suicide bombing tactics, ruthlessly eliminated rivals,
Including, tragically, India's own former Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi in 1991.
which deeply complicated India's relationship with the conflict.
Incredibly complicated. India had always been concerned about Tamil separatism potentially spilling over into its own state of Tamil Nadu, and worried about other countries interfering.
And India had a direct and difficult history with the groups involved.
Yes, India's intelligence agency, RAW, had actually trained some Tamil militant groups early on. That history contributed to the inexorable tragedy, as the book calls it, of the Indian Peacekeeping Force, IPKF, intervention between 1987 and 1990.
Which ended badly.
Ended very badly. And Rajiv Gandhi's assassination left a lasting bitterness, making direct Indian intervention almost impossible later on.
By the mid-2000s, though, the world had really lost patience with the LTTE.
Completely. By 2005, something like 32 countries, plus the UN and the EU, had banned them as a terrorist organization. Their brutality and intransigence had isolated them.
So what did the endgame look like on the ground in Sri Lanka from 2006 to 2009?
The Sri Lankan army, the SLA, adopted what the source describes as ruthless and patient efficiency. They just systematically squeezed the LTTE into smaller and smaller areas.
And civilians were caught in the middle.
Tragically, yes. In the final stages, the LTTE used tens of thousands of civilians. Estimates go up to 35,000 as human shields. Their leader, Prabhakaran, seems to have become completely detached from reality, refusing any deals for civilian safety, essentially sealing his own fate and that of his fighters.
So in that horrific situation in 2009, what were India's choices? It sounds like a terrible balancing act.
It was exactly that. On one hand, huge humanitarian concerns for the trapped Tamil civilians. That was a moral imperative, but also a political one, especially with Indian elections looming.
Because of the large Tamil population in India.
Precisely. But that had to be balanced against India's core strategic interest, preventing any hostile foreign influence from gaining a foothold in Sri Lanka, which is obviously vital to India's security.
So how did India navigate this fine policy line, as the book calls it?
They used what's described as a troika arrangement, a small core group of very senior officials maintaining constant, discreet contact with the Sri Lankan government, sharing intelligence, providing some humanitarian aid, but staying out of the fighting directly.
Was there an understanding within India about the LTTE's fate?
The book reveals there was a quiet cross-party consensus in India that Prabhakaran's end was basically inevitable and probably necessary for long-term stability. Significantly, India did not support various Western calls for ceasefires at that late stage.
Why not?
Because those ceasefires likely would have just allowed the LTTE leadership to survive and potentially regroup, prolonging the conflict given their history.
But the way the war ended came at a huge human cost.
Immense social costs, yes. Widespread allegations of human rights abuses by both sides, but particularly in the final phase. A heavily militarized Sinhala society emerged in Sri Lanka, and the Tamil community was left, quote, gutted and brutalized, without leaders, without much hope.
And reconciliation has been hard to achieve since.
Extremely difficult. Surprisingly, the physical rehabilitation was quite rapid, partly thanks to significant Indian aid, things like building 50,000 houses, demining efforts.
But the deeper wounds...
The deeper wounds haven't healed. The source attributes this to a lack of magnanimity in victory from the Sri Lankan government, combined with that leaderless, traumatized Tamil community. Reconciliation, it says, has been virtually impossible.
This leads to a really provocative thought raised in the source material.
Yes, it's quite challenging.
It questions whether, in such extreme situations, maybe war should be given a chance if it leads to a quicker, decisive end to suffering, even if that end is brutal.
Right. It directly challenges the conventional liberal wisdom that negotiation and mediation are always preferable. The book suggests that, in this specific tragic case, those international peace-building efforts might have actually prolonged and worsened the agony.
A very difficult idea to grapple with.
Definitely food for thought.
Okay, let's move to our final deep dive. India's nuclear doctrine, specifically its pledge of no first use, NFU.
A really defining feature of India's strategic posture since 1998.
Let's start with the why. Why did India decide to become a declared nuclear weapons state in '98 in the first place?
Well, the strategic environment was pretty stark. India was and is located between two nuclear-armed neighbors, China and Pakistan.
And sanctions hadn't worked?
No, 24 years of international sanctions after the 1974 test hadn't stopped the program. Plus, India felt it had faced nuclear threats before, implicitly from the U.S. Navy in '71 during the Bangladesh War,
Hmm.
and explicit threats from Pakistan on at least 2 occasions.
So security concerns were paramount.
Absolutely. Nuclear weapons were seen as the ultimate guarantor of India's security against nuclear threat or blackmail.
So how does India define its doctrine? It's called credible minimum deterrence. What does that mean in practice?
It means India sees nuclear weapons primarily as political tools, not weapons for fighting wars. Their purpose is deterrence,
Deterring what specifically?
deterring nuclear attack or nuclear blackmail against India. The goal isn't to match an adversary weapon for weapon, but to have enough survivable capability to ensure retaliation that would inflict unacceptable damage.
Minimum but credible.
Exactly. Minimum implies not getting into an expensive arms race. Credible means having a survivable second strike capability, hence the development of a triad of delivery systems: land-based missiles, aircraft, and submarine-launched missiles.
And the other side has to believe you'll use them if necessary.
Crucially, yes. Adversaries have to believe that if certain lines are crossed, retaliation will happen.
Now, there's always debate about no first use. Does it actually strengthen deterrence or does it weaken it? India clearly believes it strengthens it.
India does, yes.
Yeah.
Unlike, say, the U.S. or Russia, who maintain more ambiguity, the rationale is that NFU provides stability and predictability. It signaled that the weapons are purely defensive.
What are the dangers of other possible doctrines, like a first strike posture?
Well, a first strike posture is seen as highly destabilizing. It encourages preemption in a crisis. Proportionate response sounds reasonable, but it's very ambiguous when dealing with weapons of mass destruction. How do you measure proportionate?
And using nukes against terrorists.
As the source colorfully puts it, that's like threatening to kill a mosquito with a shotgun.
Right.
Totally disproportionate, militarily ineffective, politically disastrous.
Okay, here's a critical issue. Pakistan's development of so-called tactical nuclear weapons, shorter range, potentially lower yield. How does that complicate things for India's NFU?
It's a major concern because it potentially lowers the threshold for nuclear use. It also increases risks of weapons falling into the wrong hands, insider threats.
How does India view their potential use?
The source suggests India's position is quite stark. If Pakistan were to use any nuclear weapon, tactical or otherwise, even on its own soil against advancing Indian forces,
Then what?
then Pakistan would effectively be opening the door to a massive Indian first strike. India's doctrine doesn't distinguish nuclear use is nuclear use, and it would trigger massive retaliation aimed at inflicting unacceptable damage.
So Pakistan using tactical nukes wouldn't necessarily lead to a limited Indian response.
According to this analysis, no, it would cross the fundamental threshold. This is meant to deter Pakistan from thinking these tactical weapons offer some kind of usable battlefield option without triggering Armageddon.
We should also remember the Kargil War in 1999. Pakistan seemed to miscalculate then, too.
They absolutely did. They thought their newly declared nuclear capability would shield them, prevent India from responding forcefully with conventional forces to their incursion in Kargil.
But India did respond conventionally.
Yes, India responded conventionally and quite effectively. And international pressure, notably from the U.S. and even China, forced Pakistan to withdraw. It was a powerful lesson that nuclear weapons don't provide a free pass for conventional or subconventional aggression.
And of course, the whole security landscape keeps evolving. We have cyber warfare, sophisticated non-state actors. How does India's NFU hold up in this more complex world?
The source concludes that for now, NFU remains the best response for India. It provides stability, it aligns with India's goal of minimum deterrence, but it requires constant reevaluation. The environment is dynamic. India's nuclear choices are presented as fundamentally realistic, sober, and tailored very specifically to its unique neighborhood and challenges.
Okay. So as we wrap up this really fascinating deep dive into these 5 pivotal choices in India's foreign policy, what are some of the big overarching lessons we can maybe draw?
Well, a few patterns really jump out from Menon's analysis. First, the absolutely determinate role of the prime minister in making these calls. Leadership conviction is huge in Indian foreign policy.
Right. The buck stops there.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Second, there's this recurring theme, often boldness in policy conception, thinking big like the nuclear deal, but then paired with caution in implementation, careful steps, building consensus.
Interesting combination.
Yeah. And finally, there's the ongoing discussion about whether there's a distinct Indian strategic culture. The book suggests there is Maybe pragmatic, certainly persistent, focused on India's long-term transformation above all else.
And looking at the bigger picture, you really see India's journey, don't you? Accumulating power, carving out more independent space on the world stage.
Absolutely. Think about it from being a country asking the UN for help back in 1948 to being the country for whom the global nuclear rules were essentially rewritten in 2008 with the nuclear deal.
That's a massive shift in standing and agency.
It really is. And maybe a final thought for you, our listener, to mull over, something provocative we touched on earlier.
Go on.
While India chose restraint after the 2008 Mumbai attacks, the strong suggestion from this inside account is that future governments are unlikely to respond similarly if faced with a similar attack.
So the calculus has shifted.
The implication is clear. India's strategic thinking is not static. It adapts. Deterrence needs constant reinforcement in today's world. India's goal, the book concludes, isn't necessarily to be a superpower in the traditional mold, but to be a different power. One focused on transforming India itself, walking its own path, making its own choices.